Hey, everybody. So I'm here with Amy Hawk today, who's a regular contributor here on the channel. And today we're going to be talking about Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and his disturbing ties to what I think is one of the most dangerous Christian nationalist groups in America. And long before Hegseth spoke at Charlie Kirk's rally, Amy and I started preparing a series of talks about the movement that he's a part of. And so we're kicking that off today. Amy is the author of 2 books so far, and both of them relate to our topic in some way today. She wrote a book last year called The Judas Effect: How Evangelicals Betrayed Jesus for Power. And before that, she wrote a book about her father, who was shot down in Vietnam and spent time as a prisoner of war in the same camp as John McCain. And that book is called 6 Years in the Hanoi Hilton. Welcome back. It's good to have you here.
Thank you, Pat. I'm happy to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I have to start with something just a little bit lighthearted because this is going to get really heavy, because we're going to talk a little bit about Trump's and Hegseth's speeches today, where they were speaking to the generals, all the generals in the military. And to me, those 2 speeches today signify just how dangerous Hegseth is, because in his speech, he used the phrase "personnel is policy." And so if you have the right personnel, then your policies flow out of that. And he was trying to use it in a positive way, but I think that's something Trump really believes, that Trump has his man at the Defense Department, which they're calling the Department of War. And so on a somewhat lighthearted note, my friend Ned called me today, a few minutes ago, and he said he's been my mentor in ministry for 20 years, more than 20 years now. He's been my mentor and friend. And he called me and said, "Pat, I don't understand all this internet stuff. What does FAFO mean?"
I'm glad he had to ask you that.
Yeah. And so I said, well, it's like F around and find out. And he's like, F, what do you mean?
Oh,
I'm
no.
like, so I told him, and he's like, I still don't understand. He's, why did that guy say that? And I'm like, who said it? And he said, well, Pete Hegseth said it today when he was talking to the generals. And I was like, oh man. So I told him, and to me, it's part of this whole, machismo thing.
Yeah.
And I'd like to hear your thoughts on this before we launch into the program about Pete Hegseth and Doug Wilson, who we're going to be focusing on. But this machismo thing that I see, where they're calling it the Department of War. It is called the Defense Department, but they're calling it the Department of War, and he refers to soldiers as war fighters. And what I heard a lot today was a lot of this machismo thing, and coming from a guy from Minnesota. He grew up 30 miles north of where I am right now. And I can tell you, to be a jerk and come from Minnesota, you have to work at it really hard, because all of our tendencies are not that. Right. But it's this machismo thing. I just want to hear you talk about that, if you're seeing some of the same thing that I'm seeing.
It definitely felt, I watched the speech this morning, it definitely felt authoritarian in nature. There was a lot of verbiage, like you said, about killing. It almost sounded like, if you were to sum up, he was saying, do what I tell you to do. Don't ask questions. Don't complain. Don't send any, you can bully people. He even said you can lay your hands on people.
In basic training.
The whole thing made me think of Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men.
Yeah.
He was,
seemed like that's the vibe.
That environment. Yeah. So as a mom, because he started off saying, I want any parents out there who might send their children into the military to feel comfortable. I felt more and more uncomfortable as he was talking. As a mom, I would be more disinclined to advocate for my son and his generation as a result of his words today. And it just seemed very performative. It also seemed like what you said before, Trump has found the man that will bend his knee to him. That's all he cares about. It doesn't matter. That was the other thing, is
Right.
He's so overly unqualified to be speaking from the position he's in to these generals,
Right.
that it's just almost laughable telling them how to do their jobs. But
Right.
it doesn't matter to Trump if he's qualified or not, because he is the person that will bend his knee to Trump, and that is now the vibe that Pete is wanting to pass off to the generals in the room.
And it's frightening because Trump in that speech today said basically that we're going to war against the enemy within. And in many other speeches, he's made clear who the enemy within is. It's people who oppose him. And I think he specifically singled out a town that's near and dear to your heart, Portland. And so I guess we're at war.
It's just mind-boggling that we are in this place with this really authoritarian regime. And what you said is completely accurate, that the enemy within is whoever Trump says the enemy is. So it's going to be reporters and journalists who call him to truth, tell the truth about him. It's going to be Christians who stand up and say this presentation of Christianity is not rooted in Christ. It's a facade. It's going to be towns that have rebuked him in the past and failed to bend their knee to him. So we know what he's talking about. It's going to be immigrants. It's going to be refugees even.
Right.
So here we are.
And he's got his guy. And it's very clear that what Pete Hegseth has in common with Donald Trump is, well, I mean, yeah, sure, he's on TV and his hair looks good and everything. I envy his hair. I'm sure he's taller than me too. But what Donald Trump has in common with him, it's not the Christian faith thing that Hegseth talks about all the time. And he does talk about it all the time. And that's what we're going to be diving into. But what they have in common and what Hegseth's faith has in common, this Doug Wilson group out of Moscow-Idaho, is the word that you've used 2 or 3 times already, authoritarianism. That's what they have in common. And the of all the Christian nationalist type sects that are out there right now, I've talked about the NAR and those sorts of people who are more like the woo-woo spiritual thing. The group out of Moscow-Idaho that you're going to be talking to us about under Doug Wilson is authoritarian to the core.
Yes.
And that this is what Pete Hegseth is all about. And so he's gonna do whatever Trump tells him to do. So Trump, it's one fewer person who will be pushing back on Trump, which is what he wanted,
Absolutely. And just because you mentioned about the hair, I did see something kind of funny online that he was criticizing beards and everything in his speech. You're going to have to shave your beard and cut your hair and everything. And somebody commented, well, are you going to also dictate how much hair gel we can use?
I just think that's clearly a guy who can't grow a beard. That's all I'm going to say. So yeah. So what we're going to be talking about today, like I said, is Doug Wilson's dangerous Christian nationalist movement out of Moscow-Idaho. And like I pointed out, Pete Hegseth is a member of that movement. And so this is linked, this talk today, to this Charlie Kirk memorial service, because I wanted to talk about the speech that Hegseth gave there. But the most jarring thing for me about Hegseth's participation is that Hegseth participated. Just the fact that he was on that stage, that this man is the Secretary of Defense, and this man was on that stage, tells me a lot about this group. That I'm not going to get all into all of the dirty laundry about his life, because people have either heard it or they haven't heard it. And if you haven't heard it, you can look it up. But the categories, because again, the real danger is this Christian nationalist movement that he's part of. But the categories of things are, allegations about sexual abuse of women, allegations, really on film, some of it, of him being, public drunkenness and bad decisions and that sort of thing. And when I look at the Charlie Kirk Memorial, what it shows me is that a person like Pete Hegseth gets on that stage not because of his character, but because he's powerful. And it's a pattern that I see. It's one of the things about that Charlie Kirk Memorial was that there were all of these people on that stage who fit that pattern, where if you were to look into their private lives at all, they're not living at all the way that they're talking. And it's kind of public, but they're powerful.
I'll just add that the whole Christian nationalist movement, which I've started calling it religious nationalism, because it really is not rooted in Christ. What we're seeing is a political movement that wants power, seeking power for itself, so very superior oriented, but they're willing to stick to the script that the evangelicals want to hear from them. So it is Christian in name only. It's Christian in that they know how to pray, they know God, they know the scriptures, but the main goal is not to be transformed into the image of our Creator and go out and share love and generosity and kindness with the world. That's right. Not the goal of it. So it's not really Christianity. It's an argumentative style of gaining political control by using Jesus as the kind of the mascot over it. And it's really, really past time that Christians in America can start delineating this movement from Christianity. It's not Christianity.
Right. And I have that tension when I speak actually about it, that I refer to the people who follow this, depending on the context, I'll refer to them as Christians. I'll refer to them as people who consider themselves Christians or people who call themselves Christians. But the movement itself is there's nothing of Christ in the movement itself other than words. And so in that speech that Pete Hegseth gave to the generals today, he referenced a prayer that he says every month at the monthly Pentagon prayer meeting. And that prayer meeting, it has been led by Pete Hegseth's pastor. And Pete Hegseth's pastor is a pastor of a Doug Wilson affiliated church. And this connection is really important for people to understand, because I've done videos about Doug Wilson. I've written about him over the years. And then I kind of put it aside because I can't stand the guy. And I can't stand listening to the things that they say. And I thought, well, these are just fringe characters, but they're not fringe anymore. And just help people understand who Doug Wilson is and what this Moscow-Idaho movement is.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I became aware of him about 20 years ago. My sister moved to Moscow-Idaho, and she told me about him right away. I'm a Christian, and I'm her older sister. And so she said, hey, there's this kind of really weird church in our town. People say it's a cult, and they teach this and this and this. And I just kind of told her at that time, I said, there's some weird churches out there, but it's not anything to be alarmed about. Well, since then, he's tried to take over the town, essentially, buying up all the property. He has not only does he have a school there for the kids, but he started a college. He has his own publishing arm. So all of these materials that he prints are published by him and then sent out to this network of churches. And John Piper mainstreamed him sort of. So he's been on some really big platforms that kind of lifted him up to make him appear, I guess, like your normal average Christian pastor, but he's not.
Yeah, in the same way that I feel like I have to apologize for Pete Hegseth because he was up north of me a few miles here. I have to apologize for that John Piper connection because I was part of Piper's church for 6 years.
Oh, that's right.
This was, I think it predated Doug Wilson's involvement, but I was really alarmed when I started to hear about Doug Wilson. And they had some things in common, and I'm not going to get into all of it, but they had some things in common that made them kind of strange bedfellows in a way for a while. And I don't want to speak to where Piper is at. I don't know where he's at with Doug Wilson right now, so I don't want to put anything out there that's not true. But the guy who headed the seminary at Bethlehem at Piper's church is Joel Rigney, and he left a couple years ago. But he's the one who wrote that horrible book, The Sin of Empathy. And so he's a Doug Wilson guy. Mm-hmm. And then he left Bethlehem a couple years ago and went back to Moscow to be with Doug Wilson. But that whole Sin of Empathy thing emanated from a Doug Wilson guy at Bethlehem who was, by his own account, in an interview that I listened to him, he was really troubled by the George Floyd thing, the fact that a lot of his parishioners, young people, were being, he thought, sucked into these woke movements after the George Floyd thing. And he saw that empathy was the hook. And so he wrote The Sin of Empathy as a way to protect people from being sucked into woke movements like he would consider woke. I'm saying Black Lives Matter and stuff like that.
And that care about other people.
Right, exactly. And so that all is, so when we're talking about Doug Wilson's influence, I mean, it impacts a lot of different areas of culture. Mm-hmm. And sort of it's been in the background until now with Pete Hegseth coming to the fore.
Well, some of the most notable things are that he wrote a publication about slavery. He wrote a book about slavery. And this was about 20 years ago. But he wrote in the book that, by and large, relationships between slave owners and slaves in America were friendly. Mm-hmm. And so obviously that has gotten a lot of pushback over the years as he's gotten bigger and more prominent and people are, reading these materials. And so he has walked it back since then. He never apologized, but that kind of tells you the type of person, the framework that we're working from here. The culture in his church, the wives are to be led by a firm hand. Mm. So he never really goes past that, but everybody knows in the culture what that means. Mm. And so, it's not a surprise whatsoever that Pete has been accused of abusing women or, abusing his wives. This is the culture in the church because the men are taught that they are the head of the household. And so they will be the ones that are going to have to face Jesus for everything that happened in their home. So if the wife gets, out of line in some way or the kids, it is up to the men to get them back in line.
And I just want to make clear one thing and then another. The first thing is Pete Hegseth has denied allegations of sexual abuse and that sort of thing, although he's admitted to some of the activities and just said they were consensual while he was married to somebody else. But the other thing I want to say about it, though, is that even though he's denied these allegations, all of the stuff around it is the kind of thing that apparently doesn't bother people from this authoritarian movement. It's like like I think about it, and I think a guy who has that aura about him that Pete Hegseth has of scandal and really seemingly unrepentant, the way he talks publicly. I don't know his heart, but the way he talks publicly is pretty unrepentant of this stuff. And he's doing what he's doing now. That kind of person in my circles would just not be part of my circles anymore. But this kind of movement, there's something about it where it's like, it's not disqualifying.
No, misogyny is not disqualifying to this movement whatsoever. It's probably gives you a boost. I mean, they partnered with Trump. So, the way you treat women is of no concern because women are secondary people. In fact, if anybody just watched that CNN interview with Doug Wilson here recently, he told the reporter when she asked what women signified in his church if they were allowed to have positions of leadership, he said, women are the kind of people that people come out of. That was his quote. So, Pete is part of this movement.
Right.
I wanted to say Doug Wilson is not his direct pastor because Doug's
Right.
church is in Moscow, but they have a network of churches, and Doug is at the head of that, and he puts out the materials for it. So they're all using the same materials, and they do not believe women should vote. So there should be one vote per household. Of course, that would be the husband's vote. And Doug Wilson has been very outspoken about saying that, but then Pete retweeted that. He retweeted Doug Wilson saying that. So,
and didn't he say it like he retweeted, if my memory is right, he retweeted that CNN clip, and then he said, if I remember right, all of Christ for all of life, which is one of their mantras. It's probably their calling card, but it sounds flowery, all of Christ for all of life. But what it is all of Christ lording over all of life, including all those guys. You know what I mean? Like, you know what I'm saying? And it's a very authoritarian saying coming from them, the way that they talk about it.
Very much so. And that's why I say this is a dominion theology, plain and simple. Right. This is not a movement that's actually led. This is not Doug Wilson spending time with Jesus every morning, trying to catch his heartbeat, listen to the Holy Spirit, and then, share the actual teachings and kingdom of heaven with people. This is not that at all. This is a man whose ego has driven him to want to be called Lord, who wants to have, this network of churches, and women are allegedly abused in this church, and children. This is a man who he uses Christian terminology and verbiage, and he knows the scriptures, but he's not the Christ that he is promoting is not the same Christ that I follow, and definitely not the Christ that I see in the scriptures. It's a Christ that would prop up white men to rule the land. That's his Christ. That's the Jesus that he's following, and that Jesus doesn't exist except in Doug's own egotistical mind.
Yeah, and so all of this that we're saying right now is just introductory to why you and I are going to be doing a series of talks about him, because everything that you've mentioned already, from Canon Press, that's his publishing company, to he's got a college out there, and the Christian nationalist thing. People sometimes think a lot of people will deny being Christian nationalists, but his Canon Press published The Case for Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe. So, I mean, they're just right out there saying this is who we are. So it's not like we're calling names when we say these things. It's who they are. I've done a couple videos about that book, but when we do this, the rest of the series, we'll talk about that book in one of them. But you brought up something really difficult that we will talk about too. And I want to kind of bracket this conversation off about, abuse allegations, because I think we should we will do an entire conversation like this specifically about some of those allegations, and we'll be very careful the way that we do it, where we're gonna just go from publicly available records and talk about it. But it's not just something people are throwing stones or just throwing things out about. It's like actual things where we have public records that we can reference about this movement.
One book and person that I look to for a lot of this education surrounding him is Tia Levings. I read her book, A Well-Trained Wife, and it describes her journey of being raised in this type of fundamentalism, and then her husband made them join in with Doug's cult, and so they were receiving the training, and so what happened with her just got worse and worse and worse over the years until she finally had to make her escape. But she is a very vocal now about how this movement operates and what they're actually trying to achieve, which is the highest levels of power that they possibly can, because they believe that white men in America should have the power. And so she's a firsthand account, I guess, of where a lot of this comes from. But
yeah, and when you talk about, white men in America having the power, they have ways of talking about this stuff too, where they'll talk about like heritage Americans or whatever, that sort of thing, but it's very clear what they're talking about. And a lot of it is just very right out there. I think one reason that Doug Wilson, in my experience, that he's been successful is that it's that narcissistic, just complete lack of shame. It's the same as Donald Trump has and Pete Hegseth and a lot of these people. They just have this absolute shamelessness about them, where they'll just say and do whatever with no repercussions. And so one thing that he does, like, if he'll never see this, he wouldn't be interested in us talking about this, but if he did see it, he would laugh about it. And he would, I don't know what they would call you, but I would be some beta male. They would have these, these things, they would characterize me in certain ways. And the whole point is he's owning that sort of bad boy image, this bad boy image. He's proud of it. He's proud that people are angry. It's that kind of mentality. And what it breeds in especially the men who follow him is this sense of shamelessness. And the more of a jerk, I called Pete Hegseth a jerk earlier intentionally, because it's something that they pride themselves on, that they'll say the things that make people upset, and then they somehow link it back to, this is truth. We're standing on truth.
I mean, I think this is where we're really wanting to call on people that are truly trying to follow the heart of Christ, to search your own heart, read the red letters and really line up Doug's word with the red letters, because it's very dangerous what he's doing. It's very, because it lends itself to, there's a lot of spiritual manipulation, because he does know the Bible, he does know the scriptures. And so the people that are listening to him, and the young men and young women that are getting sucked into this movement, they think he, because he's so knowledgeable and wise, that he is somebody that they should listen to, and because he's so shameless. But if you line up his general attitude with the teachings of Jesus and the heart of Jesus, this is just a facade. It's just a masquerade, like Trump is. That's, it's and every good cult leader has to put forward a godly agenda, something that will get people to in, because he has to have some way of saying, I have the godly way, I have the best way. What we do is the best. What I teach is the most thorough and the best. And this is how it should be for all of America. All homes should have wives that call their husband Lord, and the women just stay home and are never allowed to vote or do anything. This is the way God set this up. So he is really manipulating people who would be manipulated by this, and he's really hiding behind God to promote his own dominionist agenda.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And I'll just say, from reading The Case for Christian Nationalism, again, that he published by Stephen Wolfe, the one thing that I wrestled with as I read that, and again, we'll do a whole conversation about it, was the lack of really even any attempts at reconciling this view with Scripture. It was very much about a lot of Reformed theology from several hundred years ago. And so it's like, one of the things that this type of person, and we'll get into all of this in the series, I'll support everything we're saying right now. This is just introduction. But one of the things that this type of person does, they tend to be, the people who are really attracted to it tend to be brainiacs. They, like, Pete Hegseth is a really smart guy. He was valedictorian up at Forest Lake, and that's That's something. It's not, people kind of make fun of him for being, making this mistake with the Signal chat and stuff. I think he's foolish, but he's not dumb. And the same with Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson's a very intelligent guy. And so there's this way of setting up these intellectual systems that can sound like theology. And what they'll do when you try to argue with them, which I don't, but if I did, what they would do is, well, have you read this book? Have you read this book? And it's like all of the same brainiac nerds that just really needed to be hugged more as young men, as children. And instead, now they're funneling it into this intellectualized way of taking over. I've said before, and this is where I've changed. I'll say this. When I read this stuff before, a couple of years ago, the way I talked about it is I said, these guys are just playing Dungeons and Dragons. They're imagining this fantastical world where there's these princesses who love them because they've never experienced that, and they have some control over their lives, and they're imagining a god who somehow puts them on the top of everything and gives them these powers to rule and stuff. And it's just silly Dungeons and Dragons. Now Pete Hegseth is the Secretary of Defense.
Right. Now
my antenna are up. And of all the speakers at the Charlie Kirk thing, he's the one that I'm least interested in what he said, and I'm most interested in who he is and where he's coming from and why was he on that stage. What does that signal us? So anything more that you want to say? This is an introduction to a much longer series here.
Right. No, not really. I think I got my thoughts out there.
Yeah. So
I'm concerned, like you
right.
are. Let's just put it like that. I've come a long way from 20 years ago telling my sister, "Oh, don't worry about it. This is just kind of a renegade movement church," to saying, "Look at what this man has done, and look at who the Secretary of Defense is, and if they've got Donald Trump at the helm, who is willing to obviously go along with all of this facade so that he can be authoritarian in nature." So it's a very toxic partnership between political alliance and what some people think is Christianity. It's a very, very toxic partnership we've got going on. So I think the more we can address it, the better.
Yeah. And I've got a list of about 10 topics that we'll go into in specifics. And another one I'll just mention as I'm closing here is just the network of related groups now who aren't exactly affiliated with Doug Wilson, but very closely, like Right Response Ministry. These types of people, we'll talk about them. We'll because this movement it's got tentacles. And I'll just let people know, if you watch any of their videos, like Right Response Ministry or that sort of thing, expect to get a lot of commercials on YouTube then for power generators and armor plates and stuff like that, because that's kind of who we're dealing with. So
Got it.
So, all right. So
I don't want to watch any of those. I hope I don't have to watch any of those to do this.
I'll do that dirty work.
You do that dirty work. Yeah.
So, well, thanks, Amy. This is just a good introduction. I encourage people to look into Doug Wilson and to read about these connections with Pete Hegseth. Just don't do it before you try to fall asleep. So,
absolutely.
So, all right. Thanks, Amy.
All right. Thanks
we'll
again.
talk to you probably next week with our first actual one in this series. So thank you.
Right. Sounds good. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks.